Chapter 26, Sia's A45 Dimension. Serli stood in front of the door. They had made their way to the end of the corridor. Serli glanced back. Everyone was with her. Arya looked the most calm. Serli was certain the Porukian child knew something dangerous was going on. Despite that, she didn't seem fazed by it. Serli signaled with her hand before pressing on the panel beside the door. She didn't know what to expect outside, but it didn't matter. They would be forced to engage the Flittero species beyond this door. The door slid open to reveal another corridor. This corridor was different. It didn't have any doors on either side except for one at the other end. Serli frowned. She had thought maybe this would lead outside of this structure, but it hadn't. The corridor was empty. Where was the Flittero species that Charlie had mentioned? Had Charlie lied to them? But to what end? Gibson nudged her from behind. Where are the Flittero guards? I don't know, Serli mumbled. The emptiness of the corridor was unnerving. She didn't like it at all. She motioned for them and they walked into the other corridor. Once they were all inside, the door closed behind them. Serli turned to Liane. Have you been here before? Liane pointed behind her. We aren't allowed to enter through that door. Charlie always told us that Flittero guards were outside and would kill us if we stepped in here. I don't think Charlie was lying, Gibson murmured. Something has changed. Serli agreed with him. We must keep moving. They slowly approached the door at the other end. As they began to march forward, Arya let out a small shriek. Serli swirled around ready to engage the enemy, but there was none. Look, Arya exclaimed. Serli's gaze followed the Porukian child's hands. Arya was pointing to a small glass window on the left side. Serli hadn't noticed anything as she had been focused on the door in front of her. Apato, keep an eye on that door, Serli ordered as she knelt and looked at the glass window. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. How was it even possible? Gibson must have sensed something. What is it? Serli stood again. Take a look. Gibson knelt and gasped before standing back up. Liane frowned. Can someone tell us what's going on? This facility is floating, Serli admitted. Floating? Liane repeated. It isn't on the surface, Gibson added. The window shows that we are up in the atmosphere. I cannot even see the surface from here. Sias was a floating structure. Of all things, that was the last thing Serli had expected. It means we cannot run out of here, Apato said. We need to keep moving, Serli highlighted. There must be a way off this floating structure. Serli realized this was why the Flittero species had forced Gibson and her into the restraint pods. They had wanted to keep the Sias floating structure a secret. As she turned to continue walking down the corridor, there was a sound. It was coming from the door up ahead. Serli stopped and trained her weapon at it. Gibson and Apato came on either side of her. Liane grabbed Arya and shielded her. It had to be the Flittero species. The brief encounter with the species hadn't revealed much. Now, they were going to be forced to engage the Flittero species. The door slid open and a figure stood waiting for them. Serli gasped and dropped her weapon onto the floor. I told you I didn't want to meet you again, the figure announced. But it seems you broke your word. Chapter 27, Sia's A45 Dimension. Serli's heart shuddered. She blinked her eyes repeatedly, but that didn't change the reality in front of her. It was Kiri, the Prionen female energy being that had helped her escape. Serli, you look surprised. Kiri smirked. Do you know her? Gibson muttered. Serli shook off the initial shock of meeting Kiri here. Kiri helped me escape from the Prionen vessel. Is she going to kill us? Apato whispered. Kiri stood there grinning. You better answer his question quickly. I don't have so much time. No, Serli replied softly. Lower your weapons. How had Kiri gotten here? If Kiri was here, it meant that she was part of the Prionen species and not another species. But that also didn't make sense. Gibson and Apato both lowered their weapons. I see that you have a group this round, Kiri commented. You're living up to everything everyone says about you. How did you find me? Serli asked as she knelt and picked up her weapon. I'll indulge your questions for a bit, okay? Kiri replied. It was easy to track you once you entered this dimension through that portal. You shouldn't have come back here. I was alerted to your presence and dispatched to help you. A reply that again lacked a pointed answer. Help me? Serli asked. I helped you escape once, Kiri replied. I cannot have you fall back into the situation again where the Prionen will search your memories. You mean they can track me? Serli asked. In this dimension, any outsiders leave a residual trace that can be tracked, Kiri said. Both you and Captain Gibson left the residual trace. The Prionen species have already been alerted to your presence. They'll soon send someone to take you, Serli, but enough talking now, follow me. Serli hesitated. Just because Kiri had helped her before, did that mean she would help again? Was this a new trick? Is she trustworthy? Gibson asked. Gibson shared the same doubts as her. Serli didn't know. Kiri shot them a glance. Will I be trustworthy if I help you escape? That's something you have to decide. Again, we don't have much time. I neutralized all the Flitera species on this level. That's the reason why you don't see any of them. But I can't hold them off forever. We'll follow you, Serli admitted. Gibson nodded and they walked briskly towards Kiri. Serli was glad no one doubted her decision, even though she was still not sure about putting their safety in Kiri's hands. As they neared the door, Serli kept a tight grip on her weapon. You made a wise decision, Kiri commented as she turned and began to walk briskly ahead of them. Serli tried to keep up with the Prionen figure. Kiri led them down a few more corridors, which then opened into a hangar bay. On the opposite end of the chamber was the blue sky, while on one end were several vessels. Chapter 28, Hangar Bay Sias. Kiri turned to them and pointed at the furthest vessel. That's your way out of Sias. By now you would have guessed that Sias is a floating structure. It's approximately, in your metrics, 10 miles from the surface. This is one of many facilities across the planet Tetu in the A45 dimension. Serli found it surprising that Kiri was willing to shed specifics about where they were in this dimension. It was more than Kiri had done during Serli's last encounter with her. Is Tetu the homeworld of the Flitera? Gibson asked. The Flitera belong to the Prionen, Kiri replied. Tetu is one of many planets under the Prionen. That was Kiri's indirect way of saying that the Flitera was another species enslaved by the Prionen. Serli decided there was no better time than now. You don't belong to the Prionen species, do you? Serli, I counted on you figuring that out, but I never expected it at the end of our last encounter. Kiri smiled. But then again, I shouldn't expect any less from you of all Porukians. Serli ignored her praise. She wasn't fooled by Kiri. There was a reason Kiri was here, other than the obvious fact it wasn't simply to save her. Come along, Kiri motioned. Serli stared at her. You are joining us? I need to get you back to the portal, Kiri replied. As Kiri approached the vessel, the hatch opened. Kiri didn't even hesitate as she walked up the ramp into the vessel. Serli glanced back at the rest. Gibson shrugged. This is our only way out, unless you have a better suggestion. Serli grimaced. Kiri's reappearance was suspicious, but at the same time, they couldn't refuse Kiri's assistance. Serli didn't want to dare speculate on what would happen if she objected to Kiri's presence. The interior of the Flitera vessel didn't have any compartments. Instead, it was a big space with the cockpit at the front. Before we leave, there's one thing you all need, Kiri announced. She then pressed against the side panel and it opened to reveal a set of uniforms. Why do we need those? Leanne asked. Without them, you'll die the moment you return to your dimension, Kiri replied, waving her hand in an encompassing gesture. Isn't that right? Serli nodded. Kiri's response only left Serli with another round of questions. Chapter 29, Flitera Vessel Sias. Gibson looked over the suit he had put on over his clothes. The suit was made of a thin material, so thin that he couldn't believe it would work back in their own dimension. But Kiri had been clear in her instructions. Without the suit, they wouldn't survive. Again, the lack of choices forced him to believe her and hope she wasn't lying to them. If Kiri had wanted to kill them, she could have easily done it in the corridor. There was no reason to go through the complexity of mounting an escape in a Flitera vessel and then killing them. However, Gibson had to keep in mind they were dealing with the Prionen species, or something close to it, since Kiri had avoided directly responding to Serli's questions. Kiri was just as Serli had described from her initial encounter, evasive to the core, and Kiri seemed to enjoy being evasive. Once Gibson had put on the suit, it had automatically conformed to his body. He glanced around the rest of the group. Everyone had gotten their suit on, including Arya. Gibson had thought Arya would have a problem with her suit. However, Kiri had been able to find a suitable one for the Porukian child. and Aria had taken the matter of donning the suit in her stride. She hadn't made a fuss, which had been a relief. Gibson had also observed the wave of relief spread over both Serli and Leanne once Aria had put on her suit on her own. "Aren't we missing something?" Gibson asked. The suit they had on didn't have a helmet. "Captain, you're perceptive," Kiri smirked. "I'll pass each of you a thin covering for your head, but I wouldn't put that on just yet. You only need to put it on right before you exit this vessel." Kiri passed everyone a small hood. Gibson examined it in his hands. It had a glass covering and was easily 10 times lighter than a helmet. Would this really be sufficient for them? Serli must have sensed his concerns. "Will this be enough for us?" "Don't be fooled by the lightness of the hood," Kiri commented. "Once you put it on, it will automatically attach itself to the rest of the suit. The attachment will trigger a reaction whereby the suit will generate sufficient oxygen for each of you." Gibson turned the hood around in his hands. The technology behind the suit was light years ahead of anything UHA had. He doubted the Poruk even had anything resembling such suits. "Will the suits continue to function in our dimension?" Leanne asked. Kiri laughed. "That's the point. If not, there's no use of the suit. I understand that the suits are different from what humans and Porukians are used to, but they will work." Leanne was flustered but nodded. "There are a few more things to be aware of about the suits," Kiri highlighted. "The suits have an energy shield that will also be activated the moment you put the hood on. That should protect you from any energy blast directed at you. The hood also provides sensor readings similar to your HUDs, and there is a comm system that you can use to talk to each other." "How many direct hits can the energy shield take?" Gibson asked. Kiri paused for a long moment. "How many?" "I'm not certain of it, but so far the energy shields haven't failed us." "Is everyone clear about the suits?" Everybody nodded in unison. Kiri remained standing at the center while everyone had formed a circle around her. "It's time we leave," Kiri announced. "Everyone take a seat and strap yourselves in." Gibson sat down on the seat behind her. The rest of the group followed him. The moment Kiri uttered those words, the engines began to hum, and a few seconds later the vessel lifted off. "Who's flying the vessel?" Serli asked. "I am," Kiri said. Gibson glanced in the direction of the cockpit. No one was seated there. "Are you saying?" Serli's voice trailed off. Apato and Leanne hadn't picked up on the implication of Kiri's words. "At least not yet." "We can control the vessel through our minds," Kiri said. Chapter 30. Flitera Vessel, Sias. Serli walked towards Kiri, who was standing near the cockpit. Gibson and the rest were still seated. Kiri turned to her. "Before you ask the question, I do need to be at the cockpit to have a visual of our course." Serli frowned. "How did you get to see us?" Kiri stared at her. "Is there any end to your curiosity? I notice you have a strong affinity to the young child. I'm surprised by it. Why?" "Because if the Prionen species ever found out about your strong connection to that Porukian child, they would use her as leverage. Bringing her along was a dangerous move, even by your standards." Serli felt nervous. She hadn't considered the dangers to Aria by bringing her along, not from the angle of the Prionen species. Despite that, Serli couldn't have lived with herself by leaving behind Aria again. Serli would protect the child, no matter what. "I assume you had your reasons," Kiri said. "Anyway, it's too late to go back. We'll be landing at the portal site shortly." Serli refused to give up on finding out more about Kiri. "Are you fighting against the Prionen?" "You continue to surprise me," Kiri smiled. "Yes, my species is fighting a war against the Prionen and their beliefs. Before you send me a barrage of questions, my species is called the Priotet. Both the Prionen and the Priotet are two factions of our origin species. The war we are waging has been going on for a long time. I don't think you can even comprehend that based on your understanding of time." Serli stood dumbfounded by Kiri's decision again to be open with her. "I'm telling you all this so that you don't interfere with us," Kiri warned. "You can share this information with your kind and the humans. But be warned that if you do return to my dimension again, which I believe you will, I may not be able to save you again. Our time together is coming to an end, Serli." Serli nodded, returned to Gibson's side and shared everything Kiri had told her. "We finally have some intelligence on what the heck is going on," Gibson muttered. "But there's much more that we still don't know. If these two species are at war with each other, what does that have to do with us? Serli agreed. Kiri's revelations had helped a bit. Some things had become clearer, but many things were still a cloud of mystery. Kiri had been intentional in giving her drips of information. The female Priotet's motivation had been to dissuade Serli from returning to the A45 dimension. Nothing else. Serli couldn't make that promise to Kiri. Kiri knew that, but still chose to divulge some information. The vessel banked to the left as Kiri returned to their section. "We are landing at the sand dunes near the portal. Everyone put on your hoods." Everyone stood and donned their hoods. The moment Serli put it on her head, she discovered the hood also conformed to her head, and then she felt a tightening at the edges. The attachment of the hood and the rest of the suit had taken place. Fresh air began to fill her. Serli couldn't discern where it was coming from, but it happened just as Kiri had told him. Then she heard a whirring sound in her hood. The energy shield had been activated. The glass panel in the hood came online. The rest of the group around her were indicated as green. Serli took a glance at Aria. The young child stood still in her hood and suit. Serli was impressed with Aria's ability to stay calm. It was evident that Apato had brought up the child in the proper Porukian ways. Serli felt the vessel touch the surface. They were near the portal. "Everyone, have your weapons ready as you follow me outside," Kiri ordered. The hatch door opened as Serli walked ahead with Gibson taking the rear. Serli didn't expect their walk through the portal to be as smooth as Kiri had explained it would be, and she was proven right the moment she stepped off the ramp. Chapter 31, Sand Dunes Tattoo. Weapons fire erupted around them. Serli rolled to one side, got on one knee, and fired in the direction of the armored hovercraft. She counted 2 of them. The hovercraft must have been waiting near the portal, waiting for them. Serli sighed. "Take cover behind the vessel," Gibson shouted. Serli caught a glimpse of the rest moving behind the vessel. Then Gibson came up beside her. "Is it the same type of hovercraft?" "It should be," Serli replied as she continued to return fire. A blast occurred near them, but the energy shield on their suits compensated for the effects of the blast. "Where's Kiri?" Gibson asked. Serli glanced around. She hadn't noticed Kiri's disappearing act until now. Had the female Priotet led them to a trap? Was this all part of the grand plan by Kiri? But that didn't make sense. Why bring them all the way to the portal to face death? Gibson motioned to the first hovercraft. "Wait, I see her." Kiri was standing behind the hovercraft. Then Kiri swung her arm in an arc and an energy beam lashed out against the hovercraft. The energy beam carved through the hovercraft. A second later, an explosion ripped through the hovercraft. Then Kiri vanished. "Where did she go?" Serli asked. Gibson jabbed his finger. "She's now beside the second hovercraft." Serli turned in that direction. Kiri was now there. How had she moved so quickly? It must have had something to do with the Priotet species. Was that how Kiri had been able to appear at Sias? It was becoming more likely the case. The Priotet species seemed to have the ability to travel quickly across space and time. Kiri also had never told them how she had entered the Sias. The second hovercraft then erupted into a ball of flames. Smoke was beginning to rise into the air. Serli grimaced. The smoke would attract more hovercraft to this position. They were running out of time. "It's time for you to go," Kiri said. Serli nearly jumped up at the female Priotet species voice. Kiri was now standing right beside her. "How did you get here so quickly?" Serli demanded. "We just saw you near that hovercraft." Kiri smiled. "We are energy beings. There are many things we can do that are beyond the limitations of your thought processes. You won't be able to understand it, and I don't have the time to explain it." Even if they had time, Serli doubted Kiri would have chosen to explain it. "You must go through the portal now," Kiri ordered. The female Priotet's words had a sense of anxiety behind them. It was the first time Serli had seen Kiri faced by anything. Typically, she was always aloof to whatever was happening around her. "I'll wait here until you're all gone," Kiri commented. Serli stood, gestured for the rest to come out from behind the vessel, and then they began trudging up the sand dune to the portal. "Faster," Kiri yelled from behind them. "No matter what happens from this point onwards, you must go through that portal. Do not stop for any reason." Then several sounds emerged from behind them. Serli kept marching forward. They were nearly halfway up the sand dune. The portal entrance was shimmering before them. Who are they? Arya asked. Her voice forced Serli to glance back. 3 figures had appeared near the vessel. She couldn't recognize them. Each of them wore a sleek, black uniform and visor. It reminded her of the Prionen figure that she had encountered in the Toaxi homeworld. They had to be from the Prionen species. The 3 figures were approaching Kiri, who had gotten into a combative posture. Serli stopped walking. We need to help her. Her instructions were clear, Gibson interjected as he raced past her with the others. Come on. Serli sighed as she followed Gibson and the rest through the portal. Although Kiri had been evasive, the female Priotet had come to her rescue on 2 occasions. But Gibson was right. There was nothing she could do for Kiri. Serli hoped Kiri would be able to defend herself. Serli stepped through the portal and appeared back on the planet in her own dimension. Chapter 32, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Gibson glanced around. They were back on the planet. He exhaled a sigh of relief. He was still panting from their race up the sand dune. Leanne was with him and so was Apato and Arya. He had been worried that Serli might want to intervene and help Kiri. However, in the end, Serli had followed the instructions. Kiri would need to fight her way through. Neither Gibson nor Serli were in any position to help her. They still had little inklings of the capabilities of both species in the A45 dimension. Without that knowledge, engaging the Prionen species would have been a serious mistake. Despite that, Gibson also felt bad for leaving Kiri alone. Without Kiri's help, they wouldn't be alive back in their dimension. Can everyone hear me? Gibson asked. Everyone nodded in unison. He was glad the suit he had on was functioning as Kiri had promised. Gibson glanced around the portal entrance. Who were those 3 figures? Leanne asked. An enemy we don't need to fight for now, Gibson replied. For now. That thought wasn't comforting. Gibson knew the time would come when they would need to face the Prionen species. He pushed those thoughts aside. They still needed to get away from this planet. He didn't see any sign of Siobhan. Where could she have gone? Maybe she was resting somewhere. He only hoped she hadn't gone through the portal looking for them. If she had, she would have shown up at Sias. Serli must have sensed his apprehension. Where's Siobhan? I don't know, Gibson said as he took several steps forward. Something was not right here. Apato pointed to the left. Do you see that? It looks like there was a battle over there. Gibson gazed in that direction. The scene was one reminiscent of a firefight. Chunks of boulders were all over the scene. He walked over and noticed the traces of weapons fire on a few of the remaining boulders. A small crater stood at the edge of his feet. The evidence pointed to a grenade, maybe more than one. The first hint of doubt began to tickle the back of his mind. There were a lot of things wrong with the scene in front of him. I'm here, a voice shouted in the distance. Gibson narrowed his eyes. The figure was waving to him. It was Lile. What was she doing out here? Shouldn't she be back in the Vicro? That was what she had told him. Is that Lile? Serli asked. Yes, Gibson confirmed. Lile began walking towards them. Gibson, I didn't think you would make it back alive. What took you so long? Gibson smiled. Lile then stopped as her eyes fell on Leanne, Apato, and Arya. Looks like you got new friends and a new suit. Where did you get that suit from? Gibson ignored her idle talk. What happened here? Serli exchanged a look with him. Gibson got the message. The Poruk Captain's thoracic senses were active. We ran into trouble with the Toaxi, Lilia said. I don't know how the Toaxi found us. A few of their vessels snuck up on me while I was talking to Siobhan. Basically, when you all didn't show up, I decided to come out here to find out what happened. I found Siobhan waiting for you. As we were talking, the vessels attacked us. They caught us by surprise. We both separated to draw away their fire. Where's Siobhan? Gibson asked. Lilia lowered her voice. I don't know. After we separated, the vessels split up, chasing us down. I lost contact with Siobhan. Gibson bit his lip. Did you try searching for her? She could be injured and still out there. I was scared and hiding away, Lilia replied. Gibson remained emotionless. There was more to this than Lilia was saying, but he couldn't discern it. If there was one thing he could say about Lilia, it was that she was a master liar. She could bluff anyone on anything without a single shred of remorse. I'm glad you arrived when you did, Lilia said. What about the Vicro? Serli asked. I think it could have been destroyed by the Toaxi, Lilia sighed. I cannot believe I lost my second vessel because of you, Gibson. Leanne was looking at him bewildered. Gibson didn't have the time to tell his wife about Lily. This is what we're going to do, Gibson announced. We're going to search for Siobhan first. We'll split up and search the area. Then we'll decide how to get off this planet. Lily nodded reluctantly. For a second, Gibson thought he caught a glimpse of fear on the female Aboax's face. He had no intention of just giving up on Siobhan. Somehow he found it difficult to believe that the young commander was dead. Chapter 33, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Gibson had ordered Serli and Lily to search the vicinity left of the portal, while he and Apato would focus on the right side. Lily had been unhappy to be teamed up with Serli. However, she had been smart to keep quiet about it. Gibson knew he had made the right decision. Serli was more than capable of handling Lily. That was what frustrated the female Aboax. Gibson was sure Lily would have preferred to work with him, but Gibson wanted to avoid Lily especially because of their complicated history. Serli and Lily had left a few minutes ago to begin their search. Gibson had reminded them to return here in an hour. He then moved his wife and Arya away from the portal to a nearby hill. It was too dangerous for anyone to stay next to the portal. Not only could the Prionen species come through the portal, but the Toaxi may be drawn to it again. Why are we searching for your commander? Leanne asked. Because I don't believe a word Lily said, Gibson muttered. I know her from a long time ago. She isn't a reliable source. Do you think Lily killed Siobhan? Leanne asked. Gibson shook his head. Leanne was quick to pick up on his doubts about Lily. He had entertained a similar thought briefly but had eventually dismissed it. Lily was many things but not a cold-blooded killer. At least that was the Lily he had known many years ago. He still didn't believe she had changed for the better. But I'm not taking any chances with her, Gibson commented. Do you know how to use this weapon? Leanne turned the weapon in her hands, aimed it at a distance and smiled. They all look the same. I should be fine with this. Where are you going? Arya asked. Leanne patted the Porukian child's back. They're searching for a friend. They'll be back soon. Arya looked at Leanne and smiled. Apato whispered something to the child before leaving her in Leanne's care. With that, Gibson left his wife with Arya. A few minutes later, Apato turned to him. Do you see that? Gibson stared straight ahead. A cave had partially collapsed. More evidence of something that had gone horribly wrong after he had left Siobhan on her own. The first wave of guilt began to sweep him. Had he made a mistake leaving Siobhan alone? Should he have taken her with him? He recalled that Siobhan had been a bit worried about the portal itself. But now, as he examined the cave in front of him, doubts began to surface. Apato knelt and looked at the ground. This cave didn't collapse because of any weapons fire. The explosion happened from deep inside the cave. Gibson was impressed with Apato's ability to correctly discern the situation. What had caused an explosion from within the cave? Gibson peered back in the direction of the portal. It's quite a distance from the portal. Apato pointed at the ground. Look at the footprints. Gibson recognized the footprints. They were the same as his. Siobhan had definitely come this way. Had Siobhan been buried when the cave had collapsed? Siobhan was a capable commander. Although he had doubted her at the start, she had proved it over and over again. He couldn't fathom that Siobhan would have been trapped in a cave when the explosion happened, unless she had been forced to stay inside the cave. Gibson swallowed hard, trying not to let those thoughts consume him. Then Serli's voice crackled through her device on the back of his neck. We searched most of the area but found no evidence of Siobhan. Gibson still hadn't gotten used to the device on his neck. At one point he had wanted to get rid of it, but Serli had insisted he keep it on. For now, it hadn't helped that Leanne had agreed with Serli. Begrudgingly, Gibson had relented to their advice. Make your way back to the portal, Gibson sighed. We are still searching our side and will return shortly. He didn't want to let Serli know what they had discovered so far, not unless it led to Siobhan. However, he suspected Serli would guess they found something. Wasn't this the side where Lily had emerged from? Apato asked as he continued to look at the ground. Gibson nodded, but Lily hadn't told them about any cave collapse. Maybe she had forgotten about it. Let's keep searching, Gibson suggested. Chapter 34, Cockpit Recrow. Siobhan had brought the Recrow to a halt in a valley beyond the portal. She had figured the valley would run enough interference against anyone out there. She hadn't wanted to risk being detected by the Toaxi or Lily. The adrenaline rush from destroying the Toaxi vessel had all but disappeared. Initially, she had thought there would be more Toaxi vessels roaming about the planet, but none had appeared. Siobhan had been relieved. However, she didn't want to let her guard down. With the Prionen transport technology, the Toaxi were capable of appearing anywhere at any moment. Then, the vessel's sensors detected activity near the portal. Siobhan examined the sensors to discover several bodies emerging out of the portal. She had only expected Gibson and Serli and maybe Gibson's wife. But who were the rest? The sensors weren't able to identify the bodies. Instead of Gibson and Serli, it could also be the Prionen species. Siobhan grimaced. As she was trying to think of the next course of action, a voice loomed out of the console. Have you destroyed the portal? Siobhan shuddered. The voice wasn't that of Lile. It had to be the individual who had hired Lile to plant the antimatter device at the portal. The voice continued, We haven't heard a report from you. As per our agreement, ensure everyone has been terminated. We wait to hear from you. Siobhan's blood ran cold. Lile's mission had been to kill them all, but Lile hadn't counted on the fact that Gibson would allow Siobhan to stay back. That itself had saved them from certain death. She hadn't been able to pick up any position on Lile. Siobhan suspected the female Avoax was clever at shielding herself from the sensors. Then, sensors picked up a vessel descending through the atmosphere. It was moving fast and heading to the portal. Sensors identified it as a Toaxi vessel. Siobhan had no choice but to intercept it. Siobhan engaged her thrusters and the Vicro lifted off and began racing out of the valley. She was taking a risk, but she had to. Captain Gibson and Serli could be out there. They wouldn't be able to fend off a Toaxi vessel. Chapter 35, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Gibson shouldered his weapon and released a burst of red fire at the approaching Toaxi vessel. He and Apato had just made it back to the portal when they had seen Serli and Lile under attack. Gibson had then broken into a run with Apato beside him. The Toaxi vessel had focused its weapons fire on Serli's position. It didn't go unnoticed by Gibson that Lile had taken cover behind a boulder while letting Serli front the attack. Gibson's bursts of weapons fire caught the Toaxi vessel by surprise. The Toaxi vessel stopped firing at Serli and began to turn in his direction. Keep firing, Gibson ordered. Weapons fire roared past him as he rolled away. We have another vessel approaching us, Apato yelled. It's the Vicro, Serli whispered through the device. The Vicro? Had the Toaxi commandeered that vessel? Gibson spotted the vessel approaching from the left. Apato hesitated. We cannot fight two vessels. Gibson continued to target the Toaxi vessel, but then he realized something. The Toaxi vessel also began to hesitate. That meant only one thing. The Vicro wasn't there to support the Toaxi. Cover me, Gibson said as he rushed over to the next boulder. The Vicro was now firing upon the Toaxi vessel. Both vessels began to trade streaks of weapons fire. Gibson tried to peer at the Vicro, but he couldn't see who was piloting it. It was of no consequence. The Vicro attack had drawn the Toaxi vessel away from them. Gibson waved to Apato, who joined him. Then they both began to run towards the portal. As they approached the portal, Gibson stopped. Something was wrong. Why are we stopping? Apato asked. The male Porukian hadn't noticed it yet. Lile was standing behind Serli, but that wasn't what had made Gibson stop. It was the fact that Serli's hands couldn't be seen. Gibson, I wouldn't come any closer, Lile warned. Lile, what are you doing? Gibson yelled. He kept edging forward until Lile's first burst of weapons fire stopped him in his tracks. I warned you, Lile screamed. Gibson suppressed a sigh. It was as he had suspected. Lile had betrayed him. Ever since he had encountered her in the lounge, the thought of Lile betraying him had always lurked in his mind. But he had pushed it away in his desperation to find Liane. At the time, it had been a dangerous path forward. He had no regrets as it had led him to Liane. Did you really think I found you on that station to help you? Lile said. It doesn't matter what I think, Gibson said calmly. Let Serli go and I won't hold it against you. We can go our own ways. Do you think I'm a fool? Lile scowled. Her words were drowned by an explosion. Apato pointed into the sky. The Toaxi vessel had been breached. Smoke plumes were emerging from its hull and it was losing altitude. Faster than expected, Gibson used the distraction to get closer to Serli, but Lile was quicker. She dragged Serli backwards, maintaining their distance. The two-axis vessel crashed further away and exploded into a ball of flames. "Where's Siobhan?" Gibson asked. "You really aren't thinking clearly," Lelia replied as she gestured at the Vicro. "Did the portal mess with your head?" Gibson exhaled a sigh of relief as the Vicro neared his position. He was now able to see Siobhan's grim face. He still didn't know what had transpired here after they had gone through the portal. Yet, Siobhan had done the difficult thing of beating Lelia at her own game and taking control of the Vicro. That itself was not an easy feat to accomplish. The young commander was again proving herself in leaps and bounds. Gibson gestured to Siobhan to move away. The Vicro began to distance itself from the situation on the ground. "Your commander is too obedient," Lelia sneered. "I would have been a better one to push you forward." "Whatever they paid you, I can double it," Gibson reasoned. Lelia snorted. "Look at you. Do you really expect me to believe that?" Serli remained quiet. He suspected Lelia had a weapon pointed at Serli's weak points in her back. It was commonly known one strike at a certain position in a Porukian's back was sufficient to kill the individual. Gibson had learned of it during the Pinnacle War and had executed it several times. He had taken no pleasure in killing the Porukians in such a cowardly manner, but war took no pleasure in a person's morals. War was a beast that roamed freely, devouring both victor and loser. "I'm giving you a chance to leave," Gibson repeated. "We're not at war." "A new war is coming," Lelia snickered. "If you don't realize that, you'll be wiped away with it." Then Lelia collapsed onto the ground. Chapter 36, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. The moment Serli heard the thud of Lelia's body, she swirled around. Gibson's wife was standing holding a weapon. Then Serli glanced back at Gibson, who smiled. Leanne smiled. "Your device was useful." Serli had forgotten that she had planted a device on Leanne's neck before they had run into Kiri. Leanne had willingly requested for one. It had been a backup plan in case things had gone wrong. Gibson must have been communicating with his wife while talking to Lelia. "I didn't know you had training with a weapon," Serli mused. Leanne motioned to Gibson. "When you live with a captain like him, you're forced to learn things. But to set the record straight, I hate using weapons, and that was my first kill." Gibson walked up to his wife, and it was nicely done. Leanne didn't seem amused. Serli was still reeling from the shock. "You mean you had no intention of letting Lelia go?" "None at all," Gibson said. "I knew Lelia was consumed by the credits. If I let her go, she would continue to hunt me down because she had lost the credits. That was something Lelia would never get over. It was time to deal with her betrayal." Serli had to admit that she was taken back by Gibson's tactics. The UHA captain was methodical and cunning, but she shouldn't have expected any less. Gibson must have seen her facial expression. "Do not be too alarmed by my actions. As Lelia said, we are already at war." Serli nodded. "Was she working for the Prionen species?" "Maybe Siobhan will be able to enlighten us on it," Gibson murmured. Siobhan was walking towards them. The commander must have landed the Vicro and witnessed Lelia's death. "Captain Gibson and Serli," Siobhan said, "reporting for duty again." "I thought you were on duty when I left you here," Gibson smirked. Then Siobhan shared what had happened to her after they had gone through the portal. Serli was impressed with Siobhan. Not only had she fought off Lelia, but she had destroyed several two-axis vessels on her own. Apato approached Siobhan and shook hands with her. Siobhan didn't even ask a single question about them, except for an excited shriek when she saw Aria. Siobhan then knelt and began chatting with the Porukian child. Serli observed Gibson rolling his eyes. Gibson turned to Serli. "We need to get off this planet." Serli agreed. The two two-axis vessels would have reported their engagements to their superiors. More two-axis vessels could be incoming. Siobhan, holding on to Aria, led everyone back to the Vicro. Once everyone was inside, the hatch closed. Serli told Apato to take Aria into a compartment. Leanne said she would join them. Serli then walked to the front and found Siobhan and Gibson already seated at the cockpit. As she took a seat, Siobhan turned to her. "Where are we heading?" "Just get us out of here," Gibson muttered. "We need to find a place to regroup without being detected by a Toaxi." Siobhan smiled. "I have just this place." The Vicro lifted off and was soon gliding along the surface. I need to report in with Vice-Chancellor Trez, Serli said as she stood up. Chapter 37, Compartment Vicro. Serli took a seat at the table and opened a display to Vice-Chancellor Trez. Once she had logged in her credentials, she began drumming her fingers on the table. Serli didn't want to talk to Trez, but there was no one else to liaise with regarding this mission. The intelligence they had gathered through Kiri had to be communicated back to Imperial Command. Thinking of Kiri, Serli found herself a bit anxious. Although the female Priotet had been evasive, she hoped Kiri had been able to escape from the Prionen species. There was a sound as a face appeared on the display, but it didn't belong to the Poruk Vice-Chancellor. It was Commander Juntun. He was a high-ranking official at Imperial Command with a lot of influence. Why was he talking to her? Captain Serli, Juntun announced. Commander, Serli bowed. I was trying to contact Vice-Chancellor Trez. Trez briefed me to contact you if she was unable to, Juntun commented, before taking a pause. Unfortunately, the Vice-Chancellor was on her way to the UHA embassy in Ulra when her transport was attacked. Serli took in a sharp breath. The Vice-Chancellor was abducted by a yet unknown party right after her transport entered the UHA compound, Juntun said. We strongly believe that Trez was the target of the attack and not the UHA embassy. Was there evidence to indicate that, Serli asked? She still hadn't recovered from the fact that Trez had been abducted. I'm sending you footage captured by the recording devices at the UHA embassy, Juntun highlighted. An image appeared on the right corner of the display. Serli clicked to expand it. She gasped on the contents of the image. Captain, I presume you recognize the figure in the dark suit and visor, Juntun remarked. Serli nodded. It's the Prionen species. Juntun tilted his head. The same species that abducted you in the Toaxi homeworld and took you into their dimension? Serli was taken back by the fact that Juntun knew of that incident. Trez briefed me and Imperial Command on your reports, Juntun said calmly. Despite the fact it was standard protocol to brief Imperial Command, Serli found it unnerving that Trez had shared every detail. Yes, I recognize the suit, Serli said. I assumed the figure and the Vice-Chancellor vanished. Juntun nodded. We can only assume that Trez was taken to their dimension. We expect this Prionen species to contact us. Imperial Command believes they must want something from us. That can be the only reason for abducting the Vice-Chancellor. They may not contact you, Serli said softly. The ways of the Prionen species were yet unknown to her, and it was presumptuous of Imperial Command to make any assumptions of the Prionen species. Why do you say that, Juntun asked. The Prionen species are at war with another species in their dimensions, Serli said, as she explained what had been learned about the A45 dimension. Juntun paused for a long moment. This is good intelligence you have gathered. There's something else you should know regarding the Toaxi species. Serli stared intensely at the display. The Toaxi species have been able to successfully annex their neighboring systems along the neutral zone, Juntun admitted. Initially, Imperial Command thought it was a lie, but we sent a few vessels to investigate and discovered it was true. A few planets have been completely wiped out. Millions of inhabitants are dead. Serli was shocked. I didn't think the Toaxi were capable of such death and destruction. Neither did anyone at Imperial Command, Juntun said. In response, we have activated the PR-1 fleet around Capital One. Serli couldn't believe it. The PR-1 fleet was the Poruk Empire's most powerful fleet of vessels. Even during the entire Pinnacle War, the PR-1 fleet had only been activated once. The Poruk Empire was taking the Toaxi attacks seriously. It also hinted at the fact that the Empire was scared. Based on your intelligence, I'll convene with Imperial Command and brief them. Until then, I require you to find a way back to that dimension. If, as you say, the Prionen species don't contact us, then we must retrieve the Vice-Chancellor at all costs. Yes, Serli bowed as the display switched off. Chapter 38, Cockpit Vicro. Gibson stared out at the view screen. Siobhan had brought the Vicro to a halt in a small crater. How did you find this place? Gibson asked. It was where I destroyed the first Toaxi vessel, Siobhan replied, as she shared what had transpired after taking control of the Vicro. Good work, Commander, Gibson remarked. You've done more than I ever expected when I left you at the portal. I didn't know you had it in you to deal with Lile. Siobhan lowered her voice. I didn't expect things to turn out the way they did with Lile. Nothing surprised me about what happened, Gibson sighed. Lile was a complicated person. Her greed for credits was her downfall. She has never changed since the first time I ran into her. A part of Gibson wondered if he could have saved Lile, but he doubted it. The female Abuaks had never been able to suppress her thirst for vengeance. Whoever had hired Lile had been able to tap into her need to exact revenge on him. If it had been the Prionen species, they must have been watching Lile for quite a while. Years, possibly. If not, they wouldn't have known about the history between him and Lile, and they used her at the right time to get to him. Knowing that he had also possibly been under the surveillance of the Prionen species was disturbing. Did you recognize the voice that spoke through the console? Gibson asked. Siobhan shook her head. I'm sure it wasn't Toaxi, but the voice was intentionally muffled so as to prevent any detection. Gibson grimaced. Who had Lile been working for? Whoever it was must have promised her a significant amount of credits. Lile's overarching weakness was always her desire for credits. Gibson suppressed a sigh. During his early encounters with Lile, he could have tried to help the female Aboak and get her on the right path. Maybe then it wouldn't have ended with her death. By now, whoever was on the other end of that communications would know Lile failed in her mission, Gibson mused. They didn't want any of us to survive when we returned. Serli returned to her seat. That's the part of Lile's actions that confuses me. Why would the Prionen want to kill you and me? I thought they wanted my memories. Killing me isn't going to help them achieve their objective. Serli had a point. That meant whoever hired Lile wasn't from the Prionen species. It had to be another species. What did the Vice Chancellor tell you? Gibson asked. Serli shared a conversation with them. Again, it felt good to be open with Gibson and Siobhan. It has to be the Prionen species who took the Vice Chancellor, Siobhan blurted out. Gibson ignored her outburst. Do they know of the Porukians trapped in Sias? I didn't tell them that part of our discovery. That was the right thing to do, Gibson agreed. Serli smiled weakly. Gibson knew it took great courage for her to keep information from Imperial Command. As a captain, she would be deemed treasonous and imprisoned. Where do we head to now? Siobhan asked. Gibson frowned. They didn't have many options. It was impossible to return to a Guti or other outposts. The Prionen species may send other operatives after them at such facilities. I have a suggestion, Serli announced. Chapter 39, Cockpit Recro. Serli had been surprised that both Gibson and Siobhan had readily accepted her suggestion. She had told them of a neutral zone planet, Adin, where she knew some individuals. Gibson had been the first of the two to approve it, without even asking her anything about the planet or the individuals inhabiting it. It had caught Serli by surprise, but eventually she understood Gibson's reasons. He had chosen to trust her decision. Initially, Serli had appeared flustered. How could a human simply accept a Porukian's plan? Gibson had been nice to explain that was how trust was initiated and sustained. After she had joined Imperial Command, Serli had never trusted anyone except Trez. She had felt safe only letting Trez in. After everything that had happened with Trez, her new relationship with Gibson and Siobhan pushed Serli out of her comfort zone, far out of it. Despite that, Serli had graciously accepted both of their faith in her. Siobhan had been smiling most of the time. She felt the young commander was glad that the walls amongst the three of them had finally come crashing down. Serli had to admit it felt refreshing. She no longer had to think 3 steps ahead every time she uttered a word. She could be as free as she desired. However, old habits die hard. Serli knew she would have to try hard to be open with Gibson and Siobhan, as it ran counter to all the Imperial Command training she had undergone over the years. Looking back at her career, Serli realized she had let so many things go, all in her pursuit to command a vessel. But finding Area again had begun to make her question her duties. Was being a Poruk Captain worth everything she had endured? She wasn't sure, not anymore. After a decision had been reached on her plan, Siobhan had pulled out a star chart. Then Serli had identified Adin's position. Fortunately, Adin was quite a distance away from the Toaxi space. That was one of the reasons Serli had picked the planet. She doubted the Toaxi would even venture that far out into the neutral zone. As Siobhan navigated the Vicro through the atmosphere, Gibson had gone to check on his wife. Serli found Gibson a changed man ever since he had reconnected with his wife. She could never imagine how it must have felt for Gibson when he had found his wife alive again. Does it feel good? Siobhan asked. Serli looked puzzled. Feel good? You don't have to lie to us now. I understand. Yes, it feels better. I'm glad we all can talk openly, Siobhan said. The commander was being optimistic. Despite that, Serli thought it was a good reboot for everyone concerned. What's in Adin? Siobhan asked. Hopefully a safe place, Serli said. She hoped that would be true. It was the only place she could think of to leave a Patoan area. She needed to keep both of them safe and away from everyone. Adin was the most natural choice. Then alerts began to wail across the console. Toaxi vessels on the starboard side, Siobhan announced. They're approaching us on an intercept course. Can we outrun them? Serli asked. This vessel has been refitted with a lot of power, Siobhan replied. Don't know what Lily did to enhance it, but we can try. The Vicro lurched forward as Siobhan pushed on the thrusters. Gibson came to the cockpit. Is it the Toaxi again? Serli nodded. The Toaxi were becoming a bigger problem than anyone had anticipated. We cannot let the Toaxi track us, Serli admitted. The last thing she wanted was the Toaxi to track them all the way to Adin. That would put everyone in jeopardy. Gibson pointed to the right. What's that? Serli looked ahead. There was a reddish planet with 2 moons. I got it, Siobhan said as the Vicro banked to the right and headed in the direction of the reddish planet. Chapter 40, Cockpit, Vicro. The reddish planet began to grow larger on the view screen. Siobhan kept one eye on the console. The Vicro had exceeded her expectations in terms of speed. As they approached the reddish planet, Gibson looked at her. This is Oeta. How can you be so sure? Serli asked. Gibson threw her an amused look. Siobhan looked at the both of them in confusion. Oeta was a thriving planet with orbital defenses surrounding it, Gibson explained. Siobhan narrowed her eyes. I don't see any orbital defenses. That's my point, Gibson said. The Toaxi have been here. By the looks of it, they have destroyed Oeta and its inhabitants, the Onri. Why are the Toaxi doing this? Siobhan sighed. The question should be directed to the Prionen, Serli interjected. The Toaxi are just following orders. It looks like we managed to outrun the Toaxi vessels, Siobhan remarked. Don't assume things, Gibson warned. He was right. The Toaxi had the ability to appear anywhere, especially with the Prionen transport technology in their hands. He still couldn't understand how the Prionen could trust a species like the Toaxi with such advanced technology. Head to the second moon, Gibson directed. Siobhan pulled on the controls and the Vicro changed its course. She didn't know what Captain Gibson had in mind, but she let him make the decisions. Bring us to the other side of the moon, Gibson said. A few minutes later, the Vicro approached the other side of the second moon. Hold our position, Gibson said. Here, Siobhan asked, glancing around the view screen. Gibson nodded. Be patient. Siobhan examined the sensor readings. There was no indication of any other vessels. It was most likely that they had managed to get away from the Toaxi. Then a red dot appeared on the console. Siobhan frowned. It hadn't been there before, a second dot. This is why I told you to wait, Gibson said. Where did they come from? Siobhan asked. From Oeta, Serli replied. Siobhan understood the implications. The Vicro hadn't outrun the Toaxi vessels. There had been other Toaxi vessels on the surface of Oeta. Those Toaxi vessels had been alerted to look out for the Vicro. The second moon should run sufficient interference for us, Serli continued. Siobhan felt so inadequate in front of the 2 captains. They both had deep experience, and here she was still taking small steps. She had to admit the 2 captains had survived the Pinnacle War. If you were able to survive such a long war, it meant many things. Then an alert appeared on the console. It was a distress call. Where's it coming from? Gibson asked. Siobhan checked the console. From the western side of Oeta. Chapter 41, Cockpit, Vicro. Serli didn't even have to think of what to do. Ignore it. We don't have time for it. Siobhan looked horrified. We can't ignore it. We don't know who or what is down there. Serli countered. There could be hundreds of Toaxi on the surface. I agree, Gibson said. Serli was pleased that Gibson had sided with her. They didn't have the time to go around responding to every distress call. Technically, they were at war now. The Toaxi species' decision to destroy its neighbors was only the first step. Then the abduction of threads by the Prionen had escalated matters. However, it didn't give any hint to the Prionen species' endgame. But it's worth trying to help them, Gibson said. Serli threw her hands in the air. I don't understand you humans. I'm trying my best, but I really don't get you at times. Siobhan looked at her in surprise. Gibson frowned. I'm trying to be freer when talking to you, Serli reminded her. Siobhan threw her an amused look. Not everything's about efficiency, Gibson said softly. Humanity is always about helping others, Siobhan added. That part I know well enough. But there has to be some boundaries, Serli commented. We can't help everyone. That's what makes us human, Siobhan said. Serli stared at her. The commander sounded so passionate. It reminded her of the days prior to joining Imperial Command. Serli had also been so full of passion. At that time, nothing else had mattered. It had been Imperial Command or nothing. Her desires had really overwhelmed every reasonable thought. Somewhere along the way, that passion had also been stripped away. Serli still felt it hard to reconcile humanity's ability to always seek to help others. As a Porukian, it was so foreign to her. Her parents had been the exception. They had been kind to everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. Serli had grown up trying to emulate them, but Imperial Command had again taken that all away from her. I know this isn't the Poruk way of doing things, Gibson highlighted. There's another reason for responding to the distress call. Although we know there's a war going on between the Prionen and the Priotet species, we still don't know what that has to do with us. I thought they were after the Poruk galactic weapon, Siobhan surmised. But why get the Toaxi to annex their neighbors, Gibson said. We're still missing a lot of information. Serli had to admit that Gibson's argument was convincing. She then nodded reluctantly at Siobhan. Chapter 42, Cockpit Wecrow. Siobhan brought the Wecrow down through Oeta's atmosphere. She had been able to calculate the position of the distress call. As they had broken orbit, Oeta had revealed nothing of the devastation on its surface. No signs of any vessels nor orbital platforms. As Gibson and Serli had mentioned, Oeta was silent in every way and form. Hang on, Siobhan said as the Wecrow began to shake. The shuddering continued unabated. A storm had emerged out of nowhere, swallowing the Wecrow in its belly. The rain continued to hammer down against the view screen. Siobhan tightly grabbed the controls so as to even out the vessel's descent. However, the storm was unrelenting. It was as if the storm wanted to toss the vessel to and fro. But she maintained a tight grip on the controls. I doubt anyone's sensors would be functioning in this storm, Gibson remarked. Siobhan felt her body stiffen. She recalled the last descent into the Toaxi homeworld. Despite the sensors not functioning, the Toaxi had been able to launch missiles and nearly kill them. That had been an experience she would never forget. Siobhan had no intention of losing the Wecrow to the elements of nature. She caught a glimpse of Serli watching her. Serli must have also been thinking of their last crash together. Siobhan was glad that Serli was making an attempt to be more open, but she didn't know whether Gibson really trusted her. He could be putting on a show. There was no chance for Siobhan to directly ask him, and she couldn't imagine herself even posing the question to him. She didn't have the experience of either Gibson or Serli. Their experience during the Pinnacle War had helped solidify their level of mistrust with each other. The first signs of the surface began to appear between the pellets of rain. The terrain had nothing of significance. It was a deserted landscape with a smattering of hills. And then, just like that, the rain disappeared. Siobhan suspected the storm had been in the upper atmosphere. She brought the Wecrow to a landing gently. Atmospheric readings indicate the air is breathable, Siobhan announced. Gibson stood. It's time to find out who sent that distress signal. Serli reluctantly nodded and joined him. I'll stay back here in the vessel, Siobhan announced. How far away was the distress signal, Gibson asked. It's just half a mile from this position. Chapter 43, Oeta Neutral Zone. The air was dry, the wind negligible. No one would be able to tell they had just traveled through a storm. Gibson hadn't asked for the current condition, but he was relieved to have it. He glanced in the direction that Siobhan had given him. Do you see anything? I think there's a vessel down there, Serli said. Gibson motioned and led Serli in that direction. What happens when we find whoever's in that vessel? Serli inquired. I don't know, Gibson replied. We must first determine who sent the distress call. That was the truth. They had come down to investigate a distress call, but he didn't know what to expect out here. I'm not against helping people, Serli remarked. Gibson knew she was trying to explain her thinking to him. That was a good sign. Maybe there was hope for more collaboration between humanity and the Poruk Empire. He continued marching forward. I understand your position. Being a Porukian, it's difficult to step away from the commands and protocols. But you did take your first step by bringing a Patoan area back. In my eyes, that was a big first step. Serli grimaced. Gibson sensed her concerns. We don't know the consequences of your decision, but it was the right decision. Just like now, coming down to respond to a distress call was a decision we made. I know you have reservations about it. So do I. But it was the right decision to make. Serli turned to him. You mean you weren't sure about coming down to Oeta? No one's ever sure, Gibson commented. But if I didn't make that decision to come down, it would eventually haunt me and become a regret. You might say it's a small thing in the grand scheme of the universe, but those small decisions we don't make slowly add up and begin eating away at us. Like what happened to you with Area. Serli nodded. I see what you mean. Imperial Command forces us to follow a strict black and white protocol. There's no middle ground. None at all. We are not allowed to even think of a middle ground. It's actually forbidden. I am well aware of the protocols you have to follow, Gibson said. This might shock you, but I had a Porukian who I would call a friend. Serli looked stunned. Friend? I've never heard of such things. Gibson smiled. I knew it would shock your senses. It was during the latter stages of the war. This Porukian and I were able to share and understand each other. Don't get me wrong, it took a long time to get to that stage. Were there misunderstandings? Yes, there were. But it did happen. The key was that he and I were committed to finding a way to understand each other. And neither of us wavered from that commitment. That friendship is basically the middle ground you just spoke of. I don't know what to say. I've never shared that with anyone until today, Gibson muttered. He also didn't know why he had chosen to share it with Serli. For whatever reason, the friendship had popped into his thoughts, bringing with it a host of good memories. It had been one of those inexplicable moments that happened during a raging, horrible war. Gibson hadn't thought of the Porukian until just now, which was unusual. His anger against the Porukians had always been at the front. However, the friendship with the Porukian had shown him of the possibilities between the two species. Maybe it had to do with the fact that he was getting closer with Serli. That could have been a trigger. Where is his Porukian friend now? Serli asked. Gibson lowered his voice. He died on his vessel during an attack by UHA. I see. Gibson pointed ahead. We're approaching the vessel. He pulled out his weapon as he slowed down. The vessel was the size of a UHA shuttle. There were no markings to indicate that it was a Toaxi vessel. Smoke was coming from various sections of the vessel. He motioned to Serli as they walked around to the hatch. The hatch door had been ripped open. It must have happened during the vessel's impact with the surface. Then a figure jumped out at them from within the vessel. Chapter 44, Oeta Neutral Zone. Serli jumped away, but Gibson wasn't so quick. He fell down as the figure grabbed his leg. Serli tried to aim her weapon at the figure, but Gibson's body kept blocking her. Get off him, Serli barked. The figure shifted away, hissing from Gibson. Serli assumed it was an Henri. She had personally never met one. From the looks, the figure was a male, medium height, long chin, hairless on his head, wearing a black uniform. The figure was panting as it touched his knees. Gibson stood and straightened himself. Who are you? It was apparent that Gibson had never encountered an Henri before either. I am Jewel of the Henri, the figure whispered. Why are you humans here? Serli found it unusual that the figure hadn't identified her as a Porukian. Maybe the Onri didn't know much about the Poruk Empire. We've responded to your distress signal, Gibson said. What happened here? Jewel looked at them for a moment. We were attacked by the Toaxi species. They invaded our planet with no warning. For years, we have been good neighbors with them. They bombarded our cities into rubble. Many of us got on vessels and other transports to leave the city. I was in charge of ferrying some people when my vessel was attacked. I thought you attacked me. That's why I jumped at you. Serli began to glance around. Where are your attackers? Jules shrugged. I don't know. All of the Onri I was transporting died during the crash. Can you help me? Serli exchanged a glance with Gibson. Are you the only survivor? Yes, Jules replied. We can take you back to one of your cities or where your kind is, Gibson proposed. I would prefer to go with you back on your vessel, Jules said. You can drop me off at an outpost. Serli felt an itch on her thoracic senses. That was strange. She couldn't discern any danger around her. This male Onri had the distinction of being the lone survivor. She suspected Jules was still experiencing trauma from being the only one alive. Why not stay back and help your kind, Serli suggested. I'm tired, Jules said. I want to leave all this death. My kind's dead, wiped away by the Toaxi species. I want everyone in the galaxy to know about the Toaxi. You must attack and destroy them. The Toaxi must die. Serli frowned. This male Onri was making everything complicated. She was starting to regret agreeing with Gibson and Siobhan to respond to the distress call. We aren't here to fight the Toaxi, Serli said. We came to help you. But first, let us help you check on the dead inside, Gibson said. We might be able to help a few of them, even though you said they are all dead. Jules blocked his way. They are dead. There's nothing to check. I already went through all of their bodies. We have different ways of reviving people, Serli highlighted. Our methods may help a few of your kind. She couldn't understand why Jules was being so defensive. They wanted to help, but he seemed to shun their assistance. Then Jules lunged at her and tried to grab her weapon. Serli swiftly moved aside, avoiding his attack. Serli trained her weapon on the male Onri. What are you doing? A shimmering light appeared around Jules. It then dawned on Serli. Jules wasn't an Onri. He was only pretending to be one. Chapter 45, Oeta, Neutral Zone. Jules disappeared only to be replaced by a light. You're foolish. Gibson trained his weapon at the light. Who are you? What do you want? The sound of laughter emerged from the light. Gibson, I'm surprised you cannot recognize us. Gibson swallowed hard. It was the Prionen species. All this time they had been talking to a Prionen pretending to be an Onri. Instead, Jules had been replaced by an energy being radiating a light. What do you want? Serli demanded, keeping her weapon on the light. Do you think your weapons can hurt us, Serli? The Prionen figure asked. We transcend your pathetic weapons. Then why do you want the Poruk galactic weapon? Gibson asked. For a few seconds, the Prionen being didn't say a word. Gibson felt he must have caught the Prionen being by surprise. The Prionen being hadn't expected them to know of the galactic weapon. I'm impressed by your deductions, the Prionen figure said. But it's of no consequence. The Prionen species will prevail. I'd advise the both of you to stay out of our way. If not, what happened here on Oeta is but a preview for the rest of your galaxy. With that, the Prionen figure stopped talking and then vanished. Gibson clenched his jaw. Why did the Prionen figure draw us here? I think it wanted us to take him to an outpost, Serli mused. But why? To spread information about what the Toaxi had done to Onri. I think they want other species to fight against the Toaxi and get drawn into another war. And then escalate the war to involve multiple species, Gibson remarked. It still doesn't answer why they sent out the distress call. It's possible they were looking for any vessel to come down and transport them to the outpost, Serli highlighted. The Prionen being could have transported itself over to the nearest outpost. Why did they need someone to transport them? I think they wanted it to be as authentic as possible to garner enough sympathy. Then the individuals at the outpost would believe the Prionen figure. But the last thing the Prionen figure expected was us. When the Prionen figure saw us, it must have been conflicted because it upset the plan. Serli made a good point. The Prionen strategy was sinister. They were trying to pit every species against each other. If that happened, the Prionen could simply watch all the species in this dimension destroy each other. Gibson smiled. It was a good thing we came down to respond to a distress call. Serli nodded reluctantly. Gibson knew she didn't like being in this situation. However, their decision to come down here had helped neutralize another move by the Prionen species. If not, he didn't want to imagine the havoc this Prionen figure pretending to be an Henri could have created. That doesn't mean the Prionen won't try again, Serli mused. Agreed, we need to inform our superiors about this new intelligence by the Prionen species, Gibson said. He felt uneasy by the latest move from the Prionen species. There had to be a reason for them to want to get as many species fighting against each other. Serli grabbed his shoulder. Look. Gibson turned around and looked over the vessel. A city with tall spires stood a distance from them. Chapter 46, Oeta, Neutral Zone. Gibson blinked his eyes a few times. For a moment he thought he was hallucinating. Had the Prionen figure done something to them before vanishing? That wasn't there just now, right? Gibson muttered. It wasn't, Serli agreed. The city looked eerily similar to that of Holux. Even the towers looked familiar. But that wasn't possible, or was it? I think I know what the Prionen species is doing by having the Toaxi annex its neighbors, Gibson mused. They're using these wiped-out planets as a staging area for their tests. Serli pointed at the towers. I think that city is the same as the one on the Toaxi homeworld. What I don't understand is why they are conducting the tests, Gibson remarked. Why move an entire city here to Oeta? As you mentioned before, we don't know everything. Transporting a city from their dimension to ours takes a massive amount of energy. We are again making assumptions, Gibson countered. And what do these tests, if that's what they are, have to do with your galactic weapon? Serli motioned and Gibson began following her back to the Vicro. One thing was certain. They didn't want to waste their time on Oeta. The distress call had been a trick by the Prionen species. Managing to thwart the Prionen species this time had only happened because they had been at the right place at the right time, but they needed to get back on track to Adin. Serli turned to him. Once we drop off a Patuan area, we need to decide on our next steps. Gibson didn't have a next step, not yet at least. He also hadn't decided what to do with his wife. He couldn't return her home to Beta 1. Too many people would ask questions. They would also focus on the fact that Leanne hadn't aged, just like Aria. Gibson didn't want his wife to endure such harassment. The doctors and scientists might even want to study her. He was being too optimistic. UHA would force it upon him and Leanne. There would be no way to escape it. His wife had suffered enough at the hands of the Prionen and Flitera species for years. He had no intention of putting her through more trials. I think Leanne will need to stay on Adin too, Gibson commented. You better let her know, Serli said. Gibson grimaced. Leanne wouldn't take the news so easily. After being separated for years, would she be willing to stay on Adin? If Gibson was in her boots, he would fight against it. However, it was too dangerous to take her with him. She would be a distraction to the mission. I don't even know what our mission is anymore, Gibson said. I understand your concerns. We are getting entangled in a larger and larger conspiracy. They approached the Vicro and stepped through the hatch. The moment they reached the cockpit, Siobhan turned to him. Did you see the Holux twin? Gibson shared with her what had happened at the Henri shuttle. Get us out of here. Chapter 47, Compartment, Vicro. Gibson looked at Leanne seated opposite him. Aria was asleep on the bed. Apato had excused himself once he realized that Gibson wanted a bit of privacy with his wife. Why are the Prionen species doing this, Leanne asked. Gibson had just finished explaining to her what they had encountered on the surface at Oeta. He felt the Vicro lift off as he pondered how to respond to his wife. Leanne was impatient. What do the Prionen species want? Gibson shrugged. We still don't know everything. Leanne folded her arms. What about our daughter? What about her? Aren't you going to rescue her? Of course I am. After we drop off Arya and her father on Adin, Leanne asked. That's what I came to talk about. The answer is no. Gibson was flustered. I didn't ask you anything. Leanne was making things difficult. He had expected it, but not like this. You aren't going to do what I think you're about to say. And what's that? I know you, Gibson. Just because I haven't seen you in years, it doesn't mean I don't remember how you think. You want me to stay on Adin. Gibson sighed. I thought so, and my answer is no. I can't have you tag along, Gibson muttered. Tag along? I'm your wife. If you haven't forgotten, our daughter's still trapped out there in Toaxi homeworld. I didn't mean to make it sound like that, Gibson said. It's too dangerous for you out there. We also have another thing which we haven't talked about. Leanne glared at him. What's that other thing? Gibson bit his lip. He hated being put into a corner by his wife. The fact that you haven't aged one bit since the attack on Beta 6. Leanne lowered her voice. Oh. Gibson realized Leanne hadn't thought of that matter at all. Gibson pointed at the Porukian child. It's the same with Arya and her father. We don't know why none of you haven't aged. That will attract the attention of many people. They'll ask lots of questions. But I feel fine ever since we walked through the portal, Leanne insisted. I know you do, but we can't take any chances. I don't like staying behind, not after we just found each other again. What happens if you die out there? Then I'll be left alone again. The Prionen species aren't just another species. They're ruthless. They will not let you stop them. I know. There was a knock on the door. Gibson stood. Apato stepped inside. They're looking for you in the cockpit. Gibson turned around and was about to leave the compartment when he heard a thud, followed by a shriek behind him. Chapter 48, Compartment Vicro. Serli rushed to the compartment and stepped inside the moment she had heard Apato shouting for help. Arya was seated on the bed. Leanne's body lay slumped on the floor. Gibson was kneeling beside his wife's body. What happened? Serli asked. Gibson looked at her. His eyes were red. I don't know. I was about to come over when she collapsed. We were just talking. She was fine one moment and then... Gibson was babbling. Serli knelt beside Gibson and picked up his wife and dropped her onto the bed. Arya quickly moved aside while rubbing her eyes. The Porukian child had also been crying. She's alive but unconscious, Serli said, touching Leanne's body. Gibson stood slowly. I don't know what happened. Can you help her? It was the first time Serli had seen the human captain at a loss of what to do. His vulnerable side touched her. She grabbed his shoulder. I have someone on Adin who may be able to help her. She realized she was giving Gibson hope. But would that individual she had recalled still be around in Adin? She didn't know. However, she wasn't going to reveal that to Gibson. He needed a dose of hope. She had given it. All she could do now was to find a way to get help for Gibson's wife. We can't take her to UHA, Gibson mumbled. I know, Serli said. Adin is the best chance for everyone. You should stay beside her until we get to the planet. How much further is it? Gibson asked. Serli frowned. A few hours. Gibson turned back to his wife. Does she even have that much time? We were just talking about why she hadn't aged. Could it be related to that? Serli felt it was most likely the case. I believe so. Stay with her. Gibson wasn't in any state of mind to do anything. Not until they reached Adin. She motioned for Arya to join her and left the compartment. Serli frowned as she sat down beside Siobhan. Leanne's unconscious. We need to get her medical treatment on Adin. Siobhan looked stunned. What happened? I'm not sure, Serli replied. By now, both Apato and Arya were seated behind her. The Porukian child's face looked grim. Is Leanne going to be okay? Arya asked. Serli turned to her. Once we get her the medical treatment, she'll be fine. Serli didn't take any pleasure in lying to Arya, but the child wouldn't be able to handle the truth. Not at her age. Apato nodded at Serli and patted Arya on the head. Arya looked away. Serli couldn't tell if her response had satisfied the Porukian child. That was all she could say. Even Serli didn't know what was ahead for Gibson's wife. A few hours later, Siobhan turned to Serli. We're approaching Adin. I don't see any orbital defenses around the planet. The yellowish-brown planet came into the view screen. "There aren't any," Serli said. "Take the vessel down to this position." Adin was another remote planet in the neutral zone, one of many. There was nothing spectacular about the planet, another reason no one traveled to it. Rarely did freighters go by it. Despite that, a small population of inhabitants had taken to living on the planet. Serli had first encountered them when her shuttle had been forced to land on Adin. The inhabitants, the Spiro, had been hospitable towards the stranger. During her initial encounter, Serli had been suspicious. She hadn't been able to fathom why the Spiro species would show kindness towards her. However, over time she realized that it was part of their nature, a rare one in the neutral zone, or anywhere for that matter. The Recro began to glide down the atmosphere. The sky was grey. The descent was smooth. Soon the outlines of a small city began to take form on the view screen. Multi-level structures appeared. They were scattered around without aligning to any pattern. To her best knowledge, Rutdi was the only city on Adin. However, that had been many years ago. It was possible that the Spiro species had expanded. Possible, but unlikely. "Is that our destination?" Siobhan asked. "Yes," Serli said. "Sensors aren't picking up any vessels around here," Siobhan reported. "This planet seems so dead." "That's the reason we are here," Serli highlighted. "This planet's far from anyone's concerns. Very few sensors will pick it up." "What about the inhabitants?" Apato asked. "The inhabitants live on their own, isolated from everyone," Serli commented. "That's how they prefer it. Take us to that landing pad." The Recro slowed down and Siobhan brought it down on the landing pad. It was the only landing pad on the planet. At least that's what the Spiro species had told Serli. Serli stood. "Apato, come with me. Everyone else stays here." Apato followed her down the corridor and to the hatch door while Siobhan turned and began chatting with Arya. Serli noticed that Apato had taken his weapon with him. "You don't need the weapon." Apato threw her a bewildered look. "Captain Serli, are you sure?" Serli nodded as she opened the hatch door and stepped through it. Chapter 49. Rutdi Adin. A short figure with glowing blue eyes about half Serli's height stood waiting for her. "Welcome back, Cap Serli." Apato shuffled his feet. Serli assumed the male Porukian was offended by the lack of respect shown by the Spiro figure to her. However, that was the way the Spiro species communicated. It was not out of respect. Hopefully, Apato would learn their ways. "Thank you, Maul," Serli said. Maul was in charge of security on Rutdi. The male Spiro was also the governor of Adin and the leader of their armed forces. Due to their small population, many of the Spiro species took on multiple roles. "What brings you to Adin?" Maul asked. "I did not expect to see you again. I seek your assistance," Serli said as she shared what was needed. A while later, Serli stood in a chamber. Leanne was resting on a bed. Gibson was seated next to her. Siobhan, Apato, and Arya were in another chamber. A female Spiro was leaning over Leanne and examining her using a device. Then the female Spiro looked up at them. "She's alive and well." "But why is she still unconscious?" Gibson asked. "My examination indicates she is in a sleep-induced state, which has been triggered by an unknown mechanism in her body," the female Spiro commented. "Can you awaken her?" Serli asked. The female Spiro shrugged. "I would advise against such a course of action. I noticed an injection point in her upper arm. I believe whatever was injected caused this reaction." "Are you sure it's an injection?" Gibson asked. "The incision is small, but my device was able to pick it up," the female Spiro said. "I've given her medication to keep her vitals calm." Serli didn't have to guess who had given Gibson's wife the injection. It must have been done by the Prionen species. "But how can we help her?" Serli asked. "There should be an antidote to reverse the effects of the dose that was administered to her," the female Spiro suggested. Gibson stood and turned to Serli. "I need to speak to you privately." Serli knew she wasn't going to like this conversation. Gibson followed her outside of the chamber and along the corridor until they came to another chamber. Serli opened the door and stepped inside. They were alone. Chapter 50. Rutdi Adin. Gibson knew what he had to do. Leanne's life was at stake. He wasn't going to lose his wife, not after having just been reunited with her. The Prionen species had done something to the humans when they had been abducted and taken into the A45 dimension. Antidote was somewhere in that dimension. It had to be. I'm going back into the A45 dimension, Gibson announced. I knew you were going to say that, Serli remarked. He had expected her to raise her voice and argue with him, but she hadn't. Not yet, at least. However, I don't think it's a wise move, Serli continued. Gibson raised his voice. I don't need your permission, and I don't need your help. Serli remained silent. Siobhan just walked into the chamber. What's going on here? I was looking for you and heard your voices. Gibson turned to her. I need to return to the portal to save my wife. Are you willing to help me? Of course, Captain, Siobhan said. What do you plan to do? Go back through that portal, Gibson replied, and find the antidote for my wife. How long will you survive there? Serli questioned. The last time we were there, those armored hovercraft nearly killed us. We saw Kiwi destroy them, Gibson countered. There'll be more, Serli commented. Even if they aren't there, the Flitera will be waiting for us. Gibson, you aren't thinking properly. We need time to discuss this further. Gibson raised his voice. We don't have time for further discussion. We don't even know how much time my wife has. Don't you understand? This is my family. Don't you get it? Is it because you Porukians are always about efficiency and protocol? Or maybe family isn't important to you? Do you even remember your own family? Serli took a step towards Gibson and slapped him. Gibson was taken back by her action. He took a step back and his hand went to his weapon. Don't you dare ask me about my family, Serli shouted. My parents were killed by a UHA attack. Killed. Unlike your wife who was abducted, I have no chance to find or help them. They're gone because of people like you. Serli withdrew to the other corner of the chamber. Gibson sensed she was fuming. It was so unlike her. His words had opened old wounds in the Poruk Captain. It was apparent those wounds had never been given the opportunity to be heard until now. Siobhan stepped in between them. I think we all need to stop and think carefully before we say anything else. The true enemy is the Prionen species, not the past or the present. Fighting amongst ourselves isn't helping us. Gibson lowered his voice. Serli, I have a chance to save my wife who's still alive. Barely alive. I can't bring back your family, but help me save mine. Serli stared at him. Gibson couldn't tell what was going on in that Poruk head of hers, but it appeared as if she had calmed down. I need your help, Gibson admitted softly. He could go it alone, but his chances of success were lower. Everyone in this chamber knew it. Together, they might have a fighting chance. I'll help you save your wife, Serli said. Chapter 51, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Siobhan brought the Vicro into orbit. Their journey back to this planet had gone without any fresh encounter by the Toaxi. Siobhan didn't think it was luck. She didn't believe in it. The Toaxi was somewhere out there doing the Prionen species' bidding. Gibson and Serli were seated behind her. The tension between them had all but disappeared once they had returned into the Vicro. It was the first time Siobhan had seen the ugly side of Serli, and it had scared her a bit. Serli would need to manage herself better. Gibson had fallen asleep halfway through the journey. They had left a Apatoan area in the care of the Spiro species. Siobhan found the Spiro one of the most hospitable species ever. In reality, she hadn't encountered that many species to give the Spiro such an accolade. Despite that, the Spiro made each of them feel as if they were at home. She knew that the Spiro species would take good care of Leanne. Although Gibson had been determined to find a cure, leaving his wife on Eden had been challenging. Siobhan had seen it in his eyes as he had taken one more look at his wife before leaving. She felt for Captain Gibson. He showed incredible courage when he stepped back into the Vicro. Captain, we are here, Siobhan announced. Gibson opened his eyes. What's the status of the portal? Siobhan examined the sensor readings. Her frown deepened as she re-looked at the sensors. Something was wrong. Gibson must have seen her facial expression. What is it? Sensor readings don't indicate any portal, Siobhan admitted. Gibson leaned forward and looked over her shoulder. Siobhan gave him the space to examine the sensor readings. They closed the portal, Gibson lamented. We should take a closer look, Serli suggested. Siobhan realized Serli hadn't spoken much ever since their argument in the chamber on Adin. It was probably intentional. She was surprised that the Poruk Captain had decided to join them on the Vicro. For one moment Siobhan had thought Serli would stay behind. Although things had calmed down, it was hard to read the Poruk Captain. Her silence during their journey to the portal had been deafening. Once Siobhan brought the Vicro over the area where the portal was supposed to be, her fears had been confirmed. The portal was gone. No one would even be able to guess that such a portal had ever existed in the area. The Prionen species must have decided to shut it down after they had escaped through it. Siobhan turned to Gibson. What do we do now? How do we get to the other dimension? She expected Gibson to be full of despair, but that was the last thing that happened. Instead, Gibson's eyes were shining. I have a plan. Radical, but it's a plan. His words made Serli sit upright in her chair and take notice, but she remained silent. Lay a course to the Toaxi homeworld, Gibson muttered. Why? Serli asked. A smile curled around Gibson's lips. We're going to find a way to lure a Prionen vessel here, using the Toaxi. Take over the vessel and head over to their dimension. The end.